Yeah.
Yes, Ajay.
Okay. Let me begin by formally welcoming all of you to this PAFI dialogue. It's the 15th dialogue this year in the year 21-22. And the topic is the world in disorder, economic challenges and opportunities. And we are delighted to have once again Ambassador Arun Singh back at PAFI. And of course, also like to thank Anil, I think both of them should now be formally inducted as members of PAFI because we lean on both of them regularly and take their counsel and wisdom in our work as public policy professionals. Interestingly, Ambassador Singh was first posted in his overseas posting in Moscow, and the last posting was in Washington, D.C., so you can see the spectrum he brings to us today. Close on the heels of what I say, the tale of COVID and the impact of COVID, we've been hit by this Russia and Ukraine situation and how it's impacting us as public policy professionals. We need to understand, analyze, and process the impact of, as I say, geopolitics and geoeconomics on the corporates, especially the multinationals who operate globally, and the impact it has had on the sanctions, the impact of inflation, the capital flight, the oil prices, and so on and so forth. So with this brief backdrop, I formally request Virat Bhatia, Vice President of PAFI, to take over. Thank you, Virat.
Thank you. Can you hear me and see me?
Yes.
Good. Excellent. Thank you, Ajay. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for being a part of today's PAFI dialogue on the world in disorder, economic challenge and opportunities. It's my great privilege to welcome amongst us Ambassador Arun Kumar Singh, former Ambassador of India to the United States, and before that to France. Ambassador Singh, it's a pleasure to host you here today. Ladies and gentlemen, Ambassador Arun Singh needs no introduction, but as part of my pleasant duty, I'll spend a few minutes discussing his very illustrious career, amazing contributions to the world of diplomacy, and after that, academia and think tanks. Throughout his 37 years in the Indian Foreign Service, Ambassador Singh has served in several pivotal periods in key global capitals and was instrumental in shaping India's policies, notably continued progress in the India-US relationship, India's closer ties to Israel, and formulation of implementation of the policies related to Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran, including during the period following the 9/11 attacks. Master's in Economics from Delhi University. His first assignment, as Ajay put it, was in the Indian Embassy in Moscow in 1981. I'm guessing this is still Gorbachev, where he learned Russian. Later, he served in Indian missions in Addis Ababa and Tokyo. On his return to Delhi in 1988, handled East Asia and Pakistan divisions. He also served as a member of the Permanent Mission of India to United Nations in New York between 93 and 97, and again the Indian Mission in Moscow back as a counselor and then minister between 97 and 2000. He's handled Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran divisions as the Joint Secretary in the Ministry of External Affairs, and as sort of I said, briefly conceptualized and implemented India's response to the 9/11 attacks and developments in Afghanistan specifically. He has served as India's ambassador in Israel, as a deputy chief of mission at the Indian Embassy in Washington, and from there as India's ambassador to France in 2015. In his last assignment, he was the ambassador of India to the United States till August of 2016. During his tenure spanning the Obama presidency and following the signing of the Indo-US civil nuclear deal, the relationship between India and US consolidated significantly, as we all know, and is now described as the defining partnership of the 21st century. Is also known as natural allies, two terms that are most used to describe the relationship. Ambassador Singh is a distinguished fellow with important global think tanks and academician who teaches at some of the most distinguished universities overseas, including the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. He regularly speaks at public platforms on Indo-US relationships, such as this one, Indian economic and technological trends, US foreign policy in South Asia, diplomacy, and of course, statecraft that he's perfected over his 37 years and then some. In today's discussion, we hope Ambassador Singh will discuss how the Russia-Ukraine crisis is playing out. In particular, we hope on its impact on three major issues: India's alliances with major EU countries, US, Russia, China, the security environment, and how it seems to be redefining the aftermath of the, some would call it Russian invasion, others call it military enterprise, etc. And most importantly, for the sake of the delegates in today's discussion, who are policy professionals with corporations, its impact on India's business, economic outcome, hopefully investments and treaties. Pastor Singh, you've already addressed the PAFI before, so I'm going to skip a detailed introduction, except that it now represents top policy professionals for over 80 companies, Indian and foreign, operating in India. While Anil will discuss some pertinent questions, I think we would largely like to hear your views on how you think this confrontation will play out beyond military action, because I imagine you would want to be somewhat reluctant to offer your views on how the military action will play out, but specifically where India stands. We understand the reasons why India chose to abstain, but does that decision still hold in our national interest nearly a month after the invasion? How do you believe India's doing vis-a-vis the US Congress, which is different from the US government? How are some of the recent comments by the Chinese leadership about India and its engagement to be read in view of these developments? And most importantly, again, for the sake of the delegates today, how will the economic impact be? The move towards building FTAs, EU, UK, improving trade ties with US, even though currently there is no trade deal on the anvil, it seems. We're hoping you'll crystal ball everything around these issues, minus the military maneuvers, which it seems the military experts themselves are unable to comprehend, leave alone predict. With that, let me invite Ambassador Singh, in case you might want to offer a few minutes of opening remarks to set the stage, and then my colleague and friend Anil Padmanabhan will take it from there. Ambassador.
Thank you. Thank you, Ajay and Virat. As agreed, I think I'll speak for about 10 or 15 minutes just to lay out some broad thoughts and then look forward to more detailed conversation that Anil would conduct. Now, again, given the background of all of you, I'm sure you'd like to get some thoughts related to how we see the economic situation playing out, especially with the sanctions and the broader geo-economic and geopolitical impact of that. As you mentioned, I served twice in Moscow, but although it was the same city, there were two different countries. The first time was the Soviet Union. It was the height of the Soviet Union. It was in fact pre-Gorbachev. It was Brezhnev.
Wow, okay.
And the next time was the Russian Federation, the waning days of Yeltsin. And at a time when large part of the world was celebrating holiday on 31st December 1999, I happened to be at work, but at 12:30, Yeltsin suddenly appeared unannounced on Russian TV and said that I'm now stepping aside and anointing Vladimir Putin as the acting president, and after elections to become president. And I think that was the first time that I think I beat CNN and BBC in reporting that bit of news to headquarters because everybody else was on holiday. So, but yeah, there's been a lot of ferment. But looking at the economic impact of the sanctions, I think one, of course, is the direct impact and then the indirect impact. Now, if I just look at the direct impact on India, at one level, it would be limited. And of course, there is concern in India over what will be impact on us. But the impact would be perhaps more on others, including in Europe. But in our trade with Russia is just about $10 billion. And we import more than we export. So certainly there will be impact on the individual exporters and importers. But I think one major commodity that we import is fertilizers. So that will certainly be an issue because that is required for our agriculture. And what is the alternative that we find there? There could be an impact related to defense because for India, Russia is a major defense partner. And although we have diversified, even today, around 60% of our defense inventory is of Russian origin. But looking ahead with the sanctions that US and Europe has imposed on Russia,
financial sanctions and others, and technology access sanctions. If that affects in a medium and longer term, the technology development in Russian defense industry or the capacity to maintain certain levels of production, we have to also see what is the kind of attrition they may have in Ukraine. Then their ability to supply defense equipment to India is something that we'll have to watch. But otherwise, there will certainly be indirect or second round impact because global energy prices are going up. And they went up to $140 a barrel. Then they came down a bit because of the expectation that China might slow down with the spread of COVID there. And the rise in the global energy prices, of course, will have an impact on India. I think global production is going to be impacted. And if the impact on global production, because of the disruption happening in economic relations, in payment possibilities, in supply chains, then India's exports and imports with other countries can be impacted. And how that will play out, again, is uncertain. We have to see how the payments work out. Now, if I just look at some of the figures, Europe's trade with Russia is about 200 billion euros. Now, that's a far larger figure than ours. Russia is EU's fifth largest trading partner and accounts for about 4.8% of EU's trade. But the European Union is Russia's biggest trading partner at about 38% of Russia's trade. So with the sanctions, with the limitations being imposed, that will severely hit Russia. Of course, a carve-out has been done for the energy exports part, oil and gas. Russia accounts for 26% of EU's oil imports, about 40% of EU's gas exports. 40% use gas imports. So that's a very critical relationship. So far, that trade has not been sanctioned. Even in the payment sanctions that have been done, the carve-out is there for payments related to this, but we have to see the sanctioning of some major Russian banks, freezing of their assets, some of them being taken out of the SWIFT system, how that is going to play out, because as many of you know, many companies start taking precautionary steps because even though something is not specifically sanctioned, they don't want to run the risk of later having been found to have run foul of sanctions. And so they start doing things that not necessarily required. Again, if you remember, BNP Paribas was fined $9 billion by the US, which they paid up for evading sanctions related to Iran. Now, again, I find that EU is the largest investor in Russia, with about 311 billion euros being invested by the EU in Russia. And again, here, interestingly, Germany's investment is about 38 billion euros. So where is the rest of the money coming from? And when you look deeper, it would suggest that much of the money is actually Russian money, which is round tripping and going through Cyprus, Malta, Liechtenstein, or various places back into Russia. So we'll have to see how the impact and the financial restrictions play out for all this. Now, the US, their trade with Russia is only about $35 billion. But there are 70,000 jobs in the US linked to imports and exports related to Russia. So there will be an impact on that. And of course, at the moment, the mood in the US is to take tough action against Russia. You would have seen the result of the public opinion poll that came out yesterday, that large part of US population believes that President Biden has not been strong enough on Russia. So that's the sentiment there. And that's the reason why many of these companies in the US, and of course also in Europe, have on their own stopped doing business in Russia. Severing manufacturing, severing production, services, financial transactions, MasterCard and Visa and others. Now, China, their trade with Russia is $147 billion. And again, with the disruption that will happen in Russian economy and elsewhere, we have to see how this is impacted. This figure, $147 billion, is twice the 2014 level. So clearly, both Russia and China have worked to increase their linkages after some sanctions began to be placed on Russia following what Russia did in Ukraine and Crimea in 2014. Russia today accounts for some 15% of China's oil imports and is the third largest supplier of gas to China, accounting for 5% of demand. Again, with all the restrictions on financial settlements, we are talking about what is the yuan settlement opportunity that may be there. And according to some recent figures, yuan settlements are accounting for 28% of Chinese exports to Russia. And this figure was only 2% in 2013. So you can see the trend since 2014. But still, it's a very small part of overall China-Russia transactions. And the Chinese currency accounts for about 13% of the reserves of the Russian central bank. So I think we can anticipate that in terms of direct impact of the sanctions on India, certainly it will be less than some of the other major companies, be it Europe, be it China. But of course, the indirect impact will be there. Now, how do we see the situation today? And at one level, I think our discussion today is timely because yesterday was this series of summits, the NATO summit, the US-EU summit, and the G7 summit. And watching closely the kind of statements that emerged from the summit, the run-up to the summit, I think we can identify a few broad trends. European leaders are now articulating that the European security order has changed in a long-term perspective. This is a major change, and there is no going back to the pre-February 24 situation. And they see this playing out in a long-term framework. At the same time, they are trying to prevent a full-fledged war taking place in Eastern Europe. So NATO doesn't want to get directly involved through boots on the ground or no-flight zones. I think we can also anticipate, given what Russia did, for whatever reason, and the reaction and the public sentiment and political reaction in Europe and elsewhere, that there is going to be a long-term decoupling, economic decoupling between Europe and Russia. And potentially, I think businesses would also be looking at the China relationship. Because if, all the sort of intermingling of economies that has happened in the phase of globalization post-1990, post the arrival of the unipolar phase in international relations, when the US wanted to integrate and the US believed that through this integration, you can promote peace and stability, there would be increase in democratization worldwide. Today, their assessment is that that policy has failed and that it did not lead necessarily to democratization. It generated challenges to the US. So not just in the context of Russia, but even in the context of China, I think businesses will be asking even more the question that what happens to the US-China relationship going forward? What is the lesson that China absorbs after what is happening between US, Europe on the one side and Russia? And therefore, what is the kind of decisions that businesses need to take in terms of their presence in China? And I would suspect that this is the third major impact in terms of reordering of supply chains. The first happened under President Trump, with the kind of tariffs and other things he brought about on China, the messaging related to China, that China was misusing the provisions of WTO, siphoning away jobs from America, challenging America's competitiveness. And then this was followed by the impact of COVID, an impact on supply chains as a result of that, with different parts of the world sort of locking down at different times, opening up at different times, locking down in different ways. And now I think all this is going to be reinforced by what is seen as a challenge to the European security architecture. I think as part of this, pressure is also being generated now on China by US and Europe. And the message being sent, because they worry that if China provides economic or military support to Russia, certainly it will enhance the challenges for them. So the message to China is that you will suffer reputational damage in Europe if you're seen as supporting Russia. So far, Europeans were very reluctant to sign on to the US strategy on Indo-Pacific. They had left the geostrategic aspects of the Indo-Pacific to be handled by the US. They focused on the economic relationship with China, although recently they had started talking of China also being a systemic rival. But they're really a one step behind, and German companies and others selling 5 million cars to China were not really interested in getting involved in that kind of confrontation. I remember the CEO of one of the major German companies was asked about Xinjiang, and he said that he had never heard of that kind of discrimination happening in Xinjiang. So that was their approach. But I think if China is seen as supporting Russia in Russia's present struggle in Europe, in Europe, there'll be a hardening of the position related to China, and that will certainly have an impact. So I think China is trying to play this very carefully to preserve its equity in US and Europe, but not completely stop supporting Russia. So as I said, we'll have to see how it plays out. I think China would probably want that with the struggle that is happening, both the West and Russia should weaken each other and China gets strengthened in the process. And whether they're able to manage that. I think we are also seeing enhanced consolidation of NATO, consolidation of transatlantic unity, enhanced NATO operational readiness and presence in Eastern Europe. The US and European leaders are now arguing repeatedly. They were a little more careful earlier, but now we can hear this articulation that their objective is the strategic defeat of Russia. Now, whether they are able to achieve it, we'll have to see. There is now talking of war crimes. In fact, President Biden mentioned in front of a TV channel that he believed that war crime was being committed. Then Secretary Blinken came out with a formal statement saying that they had assessed that war crimes have been committed, but then accusing US soldiers on the ground for being responsible, not taking it to the level of leadership. But at other levels, for example, former British Prime Minister Gordon Brown said that President Putin and people around him should be accused of war crime. So with that kind of articulation, I think the relationship between US and Europe on one side and a governance structure around President Putin in Russia is going to be very, very difficult for some time to come, whatever be the result in the current developments in Ukraine. And here again, one can look at various scenarios that, what if Russia sustains its efforts and continues to have a strong presence there, and there is a structure in Ukraine that is willing to work with Russia. But even if that happens, remembering what happened with the Soviet presence in Afghanistan for 10 years and then their withdrawal, or US presence in Afghanistan for 20 years and their withdrawal, I don't think it is going to be an easy situation for Russia in Ukraine. And with the kind of supplies that are being given from the West. Second alternative, that Russia walks back from its current demands. And although that's not going to be easy, I don't see President Putin walking back on the demand that Crimea should be recognized as part of Russia by Ukraine, or that the independence of these two entities, Donetsk and Luhansk. So I think looking ahead for some time to come, the relationship between US and Europe on one side and Russia will continue to be difficult, and we need to keep that in mind. Just yesterday, the NATO Secretary General said that following the NATO summit, they would like to reiterate Article 10 provision that the NATO will continue to have an open door. And although Ukraine is not formally a member of EU, not a member of NATO, with the steps that Russia has taken, Ukraine's partnership with EU countries and partnership with NATO countries has increased in the last period. And so that, again, certainly not something that Russia would have intended. We are now hearing more and more talk of chemical, biological, nuclear weapons potential use. There are 10 million refugees, with 7 million internally displaced, 3.5 million outside Ukraine, 2 million in Poland. And I think there is uncertainty related to the energy market, because which way will it play out? Because even if Europe, as it is saying, in a medium and longer term perspective, will reduce its dependence on Russian energy imports. But energy is fungible, so they'll have to get it from elsewhere. Russian supplies will have to go to other countries. And then the US energy producers will be looking to see what is the opportunity here for them. Because as you know, in the US, there is deep division in terms of the push for renewable energy by the Democrats and support for conventional energy, fossil fuels by the Republicans and some Democrats too. And so there is those producers of energy in the US, including shale, will be seeing what is the new opportunity for them. And there already the criticism of the focus on climate change related approaches is increasing. And I think for India, the challenge is that we have equities on both sides. Russia has provided a lot of political support to India historically, very strong defense partner. We don't want to put all our eggs in one basket. On the other side, US and Europe account for 50% of global GDP. Then you have Japan and Australia. The US is our largest trading partner, largest investment partner, largest single country presence of Indian origin diaspora, largest single country presence of Indian students in foreign universities. Almost 9% of our GDP is from IT sector. Bulk of it is exported. Bulk of the exports go to the US. And the linkages that we have between Bangalore, Silicon Valley is all well established. So that's the challenge for India, that with these equities on both sides, expectations from both sides, how does India navigate through this? And so I think this will certainly be a continuing challenge, which our leadership will have to handle very, very carefully as they're doing. So let me stop here, Anil, and I'd be happy to respond in more detail to questions.
Hey, thank you, Ambassador, and thank you, PAFI, Ajay, and everyone else, Virat, for having me here. Excellent summation of this circumstances. I just, from whatever you said, the conflict is only escalating at this point of time. So given from where you sit and how you have been viewing the situation so closely, can you hazard a timeline to this conflict as to when we can expect closure or not expect a closure?
As of now, I don't expect a closure because, it's been very difficult for both sides. For President Putin, he has said that Ukraine must recognize Crimea as part of Russia, recognize the independence of Donetsk and Luhansk, and of course, neutrality, etc., denazification. It will be very difficult for him to walk back on this as of now. On the other hand, I don't think President Biden can accept those kind of terms emerging from any negotiation that come, because that's the end of the Biden presidency. Already he's seen as very weak after what happened in Afghanistan. And again, many of the Central and East European countries would worry that if Russia gets what it is asking for, then what happens to the Baltic countries next? What happens in Georgia? What happens in Moldova? So at the moment, it looks very difficult that something will emerge. So I think an unclear situation is likely to persist for some time. And if you see, the Europeans are talking about ending the energy imports from Russia by the end of the year. Yesterday at the press conference, when President Biden was asked whether the economic sanctions help deter Russia, and he said that I didn't say that they will deter immediately. I said that they'll have a long-term impact. So they are hoping that over time. So I think the Western strategy seems to be to use this moment to weaken Russia significantly in terms of a future geopolitical challenge. Now, whether they are able to achieve it, how does Russia react if the economy starts getting negatively impacted and very severely? Because again, if you notice, Lavrov speaking at MGIMO said that they had never anticipated that the West would impose this kind of sanctions, which again was a bit surprising because since November, the Americans have been saying that the sanctions will be unprecedented, it will be across the board, that has never been done before, and we've told them it will be that. But I don't, for example, they didn't expect that reserves of the central bank would be impacted. And that was also done, something never done before.
So, Ambassador, the only hope right now for an end, early end to the conflict is Russia runs out of steam on its own. I mean, that they are forced to come to the negotiating table with this pincer movement of sanctions plus their own issues about Ukraine's resistance, etc.
Well, the counter narrative to that would be that the Ukrainians give in and say that, okay, with this devastation, doesn't make sense. NATO is not coming to our assistance, etc., etc. We can never be part of NATO. But I don't see either happening, really. I think we have to brace for a longer term thing.
So, Ambassador, going back to the sanctions, now, even if a call is taken to ease them or walk them back, it's unlikely to be rolled back in the near future. It'll take a lot of time because there'll be checks, verifications, etc. Like we've seen with Iran, the whole issue on Iran. So, do you think that Russia, as a supplier of defense technology in particular, gets severely impaired by this kind of sanctions, even whether if it's rolled back in the near future?
So I think it is difficult to say because one can always work out the rupee-ruble arrangement. That kind of arrangement has not been sanctioned yet. And after all, the Europeans are continuing to import large amount of oil and gas from Russia. According to some figures, almost €1 billion a day. So they have, where they have a compulsion, they have made a provision. I understand US has made a carve out for import of uranium from Russia, because large part of their uranium needs they get from Russia. So everybody has done their carve outs. And so if India, for its own purposes, needs to work out a rupee-ruble arrangement to do certain kinds of imports, option is there. But again, if you remember, Anil, in the context of Iran, where we had worked out the rupee real, the challenge was that we imported far more from Iran than Iran bought from us. So there was an accumulation of rupees in UCO Bank here. So if the trade is broadly balanced, it works. I mean, for Japan had done a similar arrangement with Iran. South Koreans had done a similar arrangement, but the trade was balanced. And therefore, there was no major accumulation of reserves on that side. We had a problem. So if it works in a way that broadly we are able to sell as much to Russia as we buy from Russia, it can work. So that's something I think the two governments would need to work out. But other than that, if you're going to use foreign exchange for any transactions, that will be difficult, because I remember even in the context of Iran, even for transactions that were not sanctioned, the US and European banks were very reluctant to facilitate the transactions because they wanted to keep whatever they were permitted for facilitating transactions between US and Iran or Europe and Iran. And only when the US Treasury specifically permitted, they were willing to come forward, because they didn't want to run, they have the risk of running foul of sanctions. So that will be a challenge. It will certainly be a challenge, and we'll have to assess going ahead, just looking at the figures as they are. But on the defense side, as I said, till we see in the future that lack of access to technology elsewhere, let's say certain kind of semiconductors or whatever, it begins to impact Russian defense technology and keeping it of a cutting edge nature. Till that happens, I think perhaps there need not be an impact on Russian defense supplies to India.
Before I go on to the next question, just requesting everyone, please field your questions the chat box or directly pass them on to someone on our panel. And anyone on this on our panel like Virat, Ajay, if you do wish to ask, please feel free to step in. So I just also wanted to, you mentioned this thing about, we have, our whole conversation so far has been on the downside risks for everyone in this business. But like our seminar headline says, challenge and opportunity. So you mentioned a very important phrase in your opening address where you talked about the decoupling between EU and Russia. But I think it's the West and Russia. But now you also have a decoupling underway with China. I mean, an attempted decoupling. So these two decouplings, what do they mean for the world the high table and also for India?
So, Anil, if you recall that with the China challenge pre-COVID and in the Trump administration, there was already a very strong articulation that there needs to be, from the US perspective, an onshoring of production, moving supply chains away from China. Even at that time, although all the surveys done subsequently showed that most US companies in China were not reducing their presence. And in fact, many of them were looking at expanding their presence, doing more investment. But many of them were certainly looking at China plus one strategy of having some investment elsewhere also in case of running into a difficulty. When the Biden administration came in, they sustained the Trump strategy on China. And the only new thing I heard was in the hearing of the US Trade Representative, where she said, confirmation hearing, that she doesn't necessarily want to talk only of onshoring, but reordering of the supply chains or reshoring away from China to other partner countries. And therefore, looking at where there are more stable relationships. Then, of course, you had the impact of COVID. And the supply chains haven't yet recovered from that. You're seeing inflation, shipping services have been impacted. And I think with this major challenge to global security structure, companies will be asking themselves that in a longer term framework, which are the stable relationships? Where are you going to see more risks? And certainly China will be seen as a greater risk because of whatever is happening in the Indo-Pacific, concerns related to how China will absorb the lessons of the European crisis, what it may want to do in the context of Taiwan. At one level, it could be that China gets worried by the manner in which US government, Western governments and businesses have reacted to what Russia did. Or it might feel that they have been exhausted by dealing with Russia and now there's an opportunity. Now, if something like that happens, what will be the impact in US? Now, I believe that Western societies tend to react much more viscerally to what's happening from Russia in terms of the challenge, less so with China. But that having been said, there will still be a reaction. So I think because of that, there'll be an additional reason for reordering of supply chains. And India should look for opportunity. I mean, our complaint has been that under WTO norms with the globalization, we didn't benefit from the opportunities in manufacturing, did well in the services and had benefits from globalization. But then with this reordering now happening and with now increasing talk of critical and emerging technologies, AI, quantum, biotech, 6G, cyber, space, all those are going to impact on the way we live, the way we work. So what is the new opportunity for us? So I think going ahead, we should really focus on that. The challenges are there. One can't wish it away. But what is the new opportunity? So I think sustained discussion now at the level of various governments and between government and business, that opportunity is certainly there and it should be seized.
But I just want to take this, what you just said, to the next level, because what you mentioned earlier of the supply chain, the third reset that is in process. And like you said, there's going to be greater scrutiny about a lot of issues related to that supply chain. So, as a public policy, there's a public policy institution. So, public affairs, but linked to public policy. How would you see, the ESG framework? Will it? I suspect it'll now pick up even faster than before, because exactly what you said, more questions will be asked on your supply chains. Where are they from? And the kind of whether they make the ESG metrics because of what Russia has this invasion or whatever you want to call it. So do you think the ESG framework is going to kick in much faster than what would have normally in pre-Russia invasion, or no? And how do our colleagues here react to it, as in terms of anticipating it and readying for that change?
So looking at acronyms, now when you say ESG,
environment, sustainability and governance.
Yeah,
basically.
So there, as you know, I just want to be sure that there, as you know, Anil, I think both scenarios are playing out. At one level, the push is that given the challenge that Russia has mounted, there should be greater focus on renewable energy. And I think that will certainly be an effort. That will also enable US and to some extent Europe to deal with the challenge they're seeing in the West Asia. Iran, you have seen reports of Saudi Arabia and UAE having their own issues with the US, their leaders not taking calls from President Biden. So there will be certainly a greater push for renewable energy. And I think if Germany is going to be under great scrutiny, because after all, they have the maximum dependence on Russian oil and gas, followed by Italy. So if Germany and others give this push for renewable energy, then there'll be a push on technology at that side. So that's one. And so that will certainly help them. But I think that's, I would say, is slightly extended medium and longer term framework. In the immediate, I think people will be looking at alternative fossil fuel, and including gas. Gas is described as a lighter shade of brown or whatever. So there will be enhanced focus there. And I think you're already seeing signs in the US fossil fuel industry about what they can do to seize this moment. But in a longer term framework, certainly, I think it will help achieve the ESG goals.
There's a question which has come from Himar Singh, and he's asking how are our Quad partners, particularly Japan, viewing these developments? And does this conflict have any impact on the Indo-Chinese relationship or tensions rather?
Now, in terms of the Quad partners, Japan has its own issues with Russia because what they see as Japanese islands, 4 Japanese islands were taken over by Russia at the end of the Second World War. And they've been in negotiations with them for getting them back, and that has not gone anywhere. And if you note, and so they have their own issues. Plus, because of their concerns related to China and need for US partnership, they have, and their security relationship with the US, they've come down completely with the US and Europe on this, and very critical of what Russia has done. They have imposed sanctions. Prime Minister Kishida is was also in Brussels for the G7 meeting. So they have the Australians, again, because of their security partnership with US, the need for US support in context of China, have again come down completely on the side of US and Europe. So that is certainly evolving. But I think one worry that people have is with the focus on Europe, with the US attention on the Indo-Pacific or China that was there, would it come down? Now, you may remember that way back in 2012-13, the Obama administration, or what was later called the Obama-Biden administration, had started talking of rebalance to Asia or pivots to Asia to signal that they were now taking the China challenge seriously. But even that they were not able to do because of continued concerns in Europe, in West Asia, and then of course you had 2014 and Crimea. So now one worry was whether with this present sort of focus in Europe, with the focus on Asia Pacific, I think they're at the moment trying to signal that they can handle both. Early March, Joe Biden convened this virtual summit of the Quad countries. And this is already the 3rd summit that has happened since the present administration came in. But that having been said, I think much will depend on how China plays the current moment. And if US and Europe believe that they got cooperation from China to handle the challenge from Russia, or that China did not support Russia in a major way, they may look at China differently, at least for the short term. But in a longer term framework, China will remain the main technological challenge to the US. So at some stage, that rivalry will come back into play. And again, I think much will depend on what China does in South China Sea and what it does in relation to Taiwan. If it escalates in any way, then it's a different situation. If it doesn't escalate, one can't rule out that US and Europe would start looking at China as a useful partner. Again, you would have noticed that with the problem with Russia, US sent a delegation to Venezuela to talk about enhanced oil supplies. And before that, they were talking of regime change in Venezuela. I think they have to look at the balance of opportunities at any moment of time.
So coming to India's stance, we prefer to sit on the fence and optimize our own interests. So will there be a blowback for this from the Western nations?
So, even if there is a blowback, let's say, you have to handle it based on your interest. And as I mentioned earlier, we have equities on both sides. And the fact that we have a critical defense partnership with Russia. So when we had the situation along the LAC in 2020, clearly the US was very supportive in terms of some supplies we needed, information intelligence sharing, but so were the Russians, despite their present equation with China. And also on India-China issues, you don't want Russia to go over on the side of China. So you want to prevent that from happening. So there is a certain, so I think in the US administration, there is an understanding of our compulsions and with the messages that are coming out from there. But of course, in the Congress, it's different. They're much more swayed by, and the analytical writing is divided. Some understand India's compulsion. Some say, hey, we expect more from India. We've been doing for India and we expect more. But I think the key people in the US understand that if they sanction India in any way for what India has compulsions related to Russia, they won't be sanctioning India. They will be sanctioning the India-US relationship because, that is a new relationship. And you need to build greater trust in that relationship that the US will be there at a time of need and understand our compulsions. So let's see how it plays out. For India, I think there is no alternative. And I want to take you back, Anil, to 2003, when US invaded Iraq. And by standard Indian positions, that was completely unacceptable. What the US had done, regime change, etc., etc. But India had been very careful because it was a new relationship that was started with the US since 2000, since President Clinton's visit. And the government was very measured in its responses. Again, if you remember at that time, there was a serious debate in high policy circles on whether, even though India didn't agree with what the US had done, whether India should send some military contingent to Iraq as a show of solidarity, symbolic solidarity to the US, but then it was killed by the other parts of the system. So there are compulsions that India has to keep in mind. And I think the way we handled Iraq, despite being totally opposed to what the US had done, I think US also needs to understand India's compulsions related to Russia. And again, from India's perspective, it doesn't make sense to have all your eggs in one basket because US is driven by its own compulsions. And tomorrow the US may have a different compulsion, may have certain expectations that you cannot meet, and you need other options at that stage.
So Anil, I think Virat wants to ask a question.
Yeah,
and
please.
I'm sure Rahul is also itching to ask a question.
Oh, please.
Thank you, Ambassador. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead, please.
I was just going to ask you that, in view of what you've just said in sort of quite elaborate terms about India-US relationship, given that US, government still understands in part, Congress much less, businesses, I might have been surprised a little bit who don't understand the long Indo-Russia, relationship over years. They were sort of, their engagement with India is only 20 years, really, in terms of big investments. So they were kind of would have questions about how did India decide what they decided. What do you think is going to be Indian government's response to deal with the US government or the Congress over the next, let's say, short term, 6 to 8 months to a year? Because everything can change in a year. But I think over the next year, where all this is quite stressful, how do you think Indian government will respond? We have some idea of how they're responding. What is the Indian government doing? And second, EU, how would they deal with that? Because Germany seems to be out there really upset. So what are we going to do there in terms of our effort, given that we have taken the stance? It's unlikely we will quickly change it.
No, so I think at one level, I don't think the government can change its basic stance, but there is nuancing happening. Something that was missing in the earlier statement, then you start seeing repeatedly later about international norms, sovereignty and territorial integrity of countries. Diplomacy was not given a full chance. So all that is there. I think India's effort, as I see it, of course, I'm outside the system now, but as I see it, India's effort will be to build even more with the US and others. Because you have a certain compulsion related to Russia. But given that, and given whatever is happening there, you need to go out there and deepen the relationship with the US, deepen the dialogue with various stakeholders in the US, so that do more with the US in the context of the Indo-Pacific, and similarly with Europe, deepen the dialogue with Europe. And of course, Germany is upset, but Germany is the biggest buyer of oil and gas from Russia. So they have their own compulsion. And Chancellor Scholz said that we can't stop it, otherwise there will be huge unemployment in Germany. So they have to understand, given their own compulsions.
I was just going to say that in view of the whole tech stuff that you spoke about, AI and high tech and latest tech and all that, that's almost all of it is US and Europe. So we really need to be careful about that piece, because that can set us back. Any kind of adverse reaction there, and as you know, we don't have a trade deal likely with the US. EU is still very early stages, UK is early stages. So a lot of effort, as you rightly said, I was just hoping that would be the response, will have to be made to handle that with kid gloves, because that can, just set us back by time, not anything else, but just set us back for a long time in terms of our ambitions.
No, so I think we cannot do what the US and Europe are doing necessarily on Russia, but I think at the same time, the effort here will be to preserve and deepen further whatever we have with the US and Europe. And that will certainly be the attempt that will be made.
Rahul?
Ambassador, I would have loved to be a fly on the wall today. Chinese foreign minister was having discussions with his Indian counterparts. Do you think there is an opportunity here because of China, again, nuanced, the nuances have changed a bit since it all started, but China is obviously in a bit of a spot given the support that it's giving to Russia. Is there an opportunity for India to wrangle some kind of a, I wouldn't call it a deal, but some kind of a understanding with China on bilateral issues?
So Rahul, I'm not able to fully answer that question right now. We'll have to see what emerges from the meetings today.
Right.
Because I think there are two compulsions there. One, our people will have to understand what are the lessons the Chinese absorbing from what's happening in Europe. And so on that, I don't have any clarity right now. So as to what are the lessons they have absorbed. Second, they have a compulsion to try and get our Prime Minister to attend the BRICS summit. Now, if you remember in 2017, when we had the Doklam crisis, at that time, one of the things that sort of compelled them to walk back from where they were was because they needed to get the Indian Prime Minister over to China. I think then it was the SCO meeting.
SCO thing, yeah.
So there is some leverage there, but we'll have to see. And ultimately, I think we can really respond to your question after seeing what emerges from the meetings today.
Anil, back to you.
No, I just, Deepak had a question. Just want to ask that. In fact, it got subsumed in your earlier response, but he's asking a very direct question that are we seeing the beginning of a reset of the global high table, and particularly in the light of the upcoming presidency of Germany in the G7?
So I think there is certainly some reset of the global high table happening, because before February 24, one could say that there were three major powers now globally: US, Russia, and China. US clearly the leading power. Russia, no economic match, but in defense, well within its sort of a match and perhaps more. And China, not yet a military challenge, but an economic and technological challenge. These were the big players. And then there were others. There were the Europeans, Germany, France, UK. We were there, Japan and others. Now this is the big game between the top three. And we have to see what emerges from that. Directly between 1 and 2, and the third watching on the sidelines to see how it can benefit from that. All big wars have resulted in major reordering. After all, the US emerged after the Second World War, after decline of Germany, UK, and everyone else. And so what emerges after this struggle in Europe, we'll have to see. And one can't rule out, some are talking about that you may be left largely with now tables being reset a bit with the US and China as the big players, and Russia not quite where it was. But let's see, these are all, till it actually concludes, one doesn't know where we will be.
I have lots more questions, but we are out of time. I see Vinita is already on the screen. So back to you. I'll hand off. Thank you so much, Ambassador. It's always a pleasure speaking to you. And thank you, PAFI, again. Over to you, Vinita.
This is, thank you, Ambassador. I think one of the most difficult vote of thanks I could, thank you certainly for explaining in so many different tangents the fallout of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I could actually really sum up in 3 points that have emerged. It's a very difficult call, what you've said. We're in a very, very fluid situation. But starting with the last point you made on China, it's kind of a lever, I also feel, with BRICS, that India can use this opportunity. And the other part is that China is the chair of RIC, also Russia, India, China, trilateral, which is going to happen. And this could actually be used by India as a lever, as an opportunity to kind of, ease the standoff. But this is yet to be seen. What I found very interesting for all of us here, whatever the political fallouts are, and these are not under our control at all, but what we can really seize the opportunity in is the economic fallout. And Ambassador, you have really given us 2 very good insights. One, how do we really minimize the slip in gains vis-a-vis the countries we have invested in so much over the last at least 2 decades, which is the US and China. And both to us are critical partners for various reasons beyond geopolitical security. Russia, of course, is there, and we've taken a stand by not calling an invasion. So I think that's where it is. And the second point you made was, how do we really now work on the 3 windows of opportunities, be it, as you said, renewable energy, China looking as a riskier partner. How do we bring manufacturing into India? And the third most important thing is, can we make a dent in the global supply chain with what we keep talking of, Atmanirbhar Bharat today, and get ourselves pushed up, be it with EU, be it with the US. So I purely looking from an economic angle, it's not easy. And, one just prays that there are a lot more Chanakyas who get reborn and, they make sense with a different kind of a strategy, which includes more of Shastra and not just Shastra. And I really can't think of words. It's one of the most difficult sessions. Hearing you, I thought I was spinning in different Venn diagrams where one matrix falls as a sub-matrix of another. And, it's just a whole cycle of you give one response and you'll have plenty of other, reactions. So, but thank you for taking up such a complex subject. And I think, Ajay, you sitting in the other part of the world will also be able to connect with this in a different way. So I just hope all this ends peacefully for all, and we are able to do something better. We've hardly recovered. We've hardly had 24 hours of recovery from COVID, and we've spun into another huge war pandemic, it seems. So with this, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us, and thank you, Ambassador, again, and thank you, Anil. This was really a tough session for you to moderate as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.